Have you ever imagined yourself standing on the windswept shores of Scandinavia, clad in fur and iron, staring across a foggy fjord with axe in hand? Or perhaps, like many, you've absorbed the cinematic image of a Viking, brutal, wild-eyed, bellowing into battle, horned helmet gleaming in the sun. But what if I told you, most of that is pure fiction? Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here. You've just entered a community where history isn't just recited. It's explored, questioned, and sometimes turned upside down. If that sounds like your kind of journey, don't forget to subscribe, join the Viking historian family, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Because today we begin uncovering the truth layer by layer about what it really meant to be a Viking warrior. Let's get into it. Modern pop culture often paints the Vikings as a race entirely comprised of warriors. Shows like Vikings or The Last Kingdom, while visually stunning, tend to blur the lines between entertainment and historical reality. In these series, nearly every male Viking carries a weapon. They're always battle-ready, almost gladiatorial in nature. But historical records tell us something very different. The Viking Age, which spanned roughly from 793 to 1066 CE, was a complex era shaped by commerce, settlement, diplomacy, faith, and yes, violence. But not everyone with Norse blood and a boat was a warrior. In fact, many Vikings lived their entire lives without ever engaging in a true battlefield skirmish. When we speak of Vikings, we're actually using a term that refers more to an activity than an ethnicity. To go a Viking was a verb. It meant to embark on a raid or expedition. It wasn't a race, nor a nation, nor even a standing army. It was a job description for some, and a seasonal pursuit for others. The vast majority of Norse people were farmers, fishermen, craftspeople, or traders. Warfare was just one thread in a much larger societal tapestry. But that doesn't mean the warrior class wasn't real. It was, and they were formidable. The question is, how did they come to be? To understand Viking warriors, we must start where all human experience begins, childhood. In the harsh climates of Scandinavia, survival wasn't guaranteed. From the moment they could walk, children were expected to contribute. This wasn't militaristic training in the modern sense, but it did create a natural foundation for physical resilience, coordination, and mental toughness. Young boys learned to hunt game in the forests, quietly, with patience, with deadly aim. They rowed boats across icy lakes, strengthening their backs and shoulders. They herded livestock, split wood, and, when they could lift them, were taught to handle tools that could just as easily be used as weapons. Axes were a fact of life in the Viking world. They were not just instruments of war, but of survival. For chopping firewood, clearing brush, building homes, or breaking ice. A boy might start with a small hatchet, learning not just how to swing, but how to aim with precision, to cut at an angle, to control both force and direction. These were subtle, slow lessons, never dressed up as warrior training, but laying the foundation for it all the same. By adolescence, most Viking youths had a functional familiarity with physical hardship and a keen spatial awareness, both critical traits for warriors. But combat training, as we'll explore in Part 2, didn't really begin until the mid to late teenage years. And even then, it was reserved for those who were chosen, or who chose it. Another major myth, that Vikings lived in a permanent state of war. The truth is far more nuanced. In the agrarian calendar of the Viking world, war simply wasn't sustainable year-round. Raids were planned around the seasons. Spring was for preparation, building ships, gathering supplies, training men. Summer was for the sea, the time when rivers and coastal routes were navigable. Autumn brought harvest, and most men returned home to secure food and prepare for the long, unforgiving winter. Only the most professional warrior elites, such as royal retinues or mercenaries, fought consistently across the year. Most raiders weren't soldiers by profession. They were farmers by trade, men who temporarily left home for the promise of silver, plunder, or glory. They had no standing army, no professional boot camps, no war colleges. Instead, they relied on inherited traditions, practical experience, and the teachings of elder warriors in their communities. Now, let's talk about one of the most compelling yet misunderstood figures of Viking lore, the berserker. The popular image is unmistakable. A frenzied warrior, eyes glazed with rage, howling beneath a bare pelt as he charges headlong into the enemy. But who were these berserkers, really? And did they even exist? Old Norse sagas do mention berserkers, berserker, meaning bear shirt, and describe their near-supernatural ferocity in combat. Some modern scholars suggest they may have entered trance-like states, perhaps induced by ritual, mushroom-based hallucinogens like Amanita muscaria, or extreme psychological conditioning. Others think the berserker was more symbolic, a cultural archetype meant to inspire fear and awe, rather than a literal battlefield tactic. But even if berserkers did exist, they were the exception, not the norm. Most Viking warriors were far more disciplined, especially when operating in organized formations. This brings us to one of the most iconic Viking strategies, one that's often glossed over in Hollywood. The Skjoldborg shield wall was the backbone of Viking military tactics. Forget the chaotic free-for-all seen in many Viking shows. Real combat was far more structured. The shield wall wasn't just a defense, it was a mobile formation, a line of interlocked shields moving forward as one. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears bristling through the gaps. It was designed to absorb and repel, to create unity and force concentration. Positioning within the wall was strategic. The most experienced fighters took the front line, absorbing the brunt of impact. Younger or less seasoned warriors filled the rear, where they could thrust over the shoulders of those ahead. The wall was only as strong as its discipline. If one man broke rank, the entire formation could collapse. This required communication, timing, trust, and most of all, training. So while the Vikings didn't have barracks or boot camps, the warrior bands who fought regularly together had their own routines and rituals. They drilled, they sparred, and they practiced maneuvers. War was not wild chaos. It was a deadly choreography, refined by tradition. Let's settle one of the most stubborn myths in Viking history: the horned helmet. Despite what Halloween costumes or Wagnerian operas may have you believe, there is zero historical evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets in battle. They simply wouldn't have been practical. Horns would catch weapons, unbalance the wearer, and provide an easy grip for enemies to pull a warrior down. The image dates back to 19th century Romanticism, when costume designers for operas and plays crafted dramatic, otherworldly Norse imagery, horns included. Actual Viking helmets were simple, functional, and rarely preserved in the archaeological record. The Geirmundbu helmet, discovered in Norway, is one of the only complete examples. It had a rounded iron cap, a guard for the eyes and nose, and reinforced rivets, designed for protection, not theatrics. To become a Viking warrior wasn't just a matter of age or ambition. It was a matter of standing, skill, and most critically, kinship. Warfare was not a solitary affair in the Norse world. It was inherently social, deeply tribal. One did not simply apply to become a warrior. He was introduced, vouched for, tested, first by his family, then by his village, and ultimately by the men he would fight beside. Most boys began to show martial promise between the ages of 12 and 15. At this age, a young man might be invited, never told, but invited, to begin observing the combat drills of his local herd. A herd was a warband, typically loyal to a local chieftain or nobleman. These groups functioned as both security forces and elite retinues, mobile and cohesive, hardened by years of cooperative experience. Participation was never guaranteed. You had to be blood, or prove your worth in blood. Unlike the Roman legions or the later feudal knights, Vikings did not train in state-run academies. Their military instruction was intimate, oral, and experiential. Mentorship was paramount. A promising youth would be paired with an elder warrior, perhaps an uncle, a father, a brother-in-arms, who would take personal responsibility for his education. This wasn't just physical instruction. It was moral, spiritual, and reputational. Swordplay was not the first lesson, nor was it the most important. That honor went to honor itself. In Norse society, honor was more than personal pride. It was your standing in the community, the legacy of your family, the currency by which alliances were made or broken. A warrior's worth was not only measured by his kills, but by his loyalty, his word, his restraint. Bravery was vital, yes, but wise bravery was revered above reckless bravado. Young warriors were drilled in oral sagas, particularly those that chronicled heroic deaths, noble betrayals, and the sacred bonds of foster brotherhood, the sworn brotherhood between warriors. These stories served as blueprints for behavior. They guided not just how a man fought, but how he lived and how he died. Many regions practiced informal rites of passage that marked the transition from boyhood to manhood, and more specifically, from manhood into the warrior class. These ceremonies varied across Scandinavia, depending on time period, local customs, and social rank, but often involved symbolic hardship, spiritual sacrifice, and sometimes ritual combat. One common element, oath-taking. To be welcomed into a hired, or to serve a chieftain, a young warrior often had to swear a sacred oath. These were no mere pledges. They were seen as binding in the eyes of both men and gods. Sworn on ancestral blades, over sacred fires, or upon blood-drenched earth, these oaths formalized a man's role not only in his warband, but in the destiny of his people. An oathbreaker, known as a villein, was worse than a coward. He was considered cursed, stripped of protection by both gods and kin. This social death was often worse than physical punishment. He could be exiled, outcast, or branded with shameful marks carved into his skin. These rituals were more than tests of courage. They were thresholds, points of no return. Once crossed, the path of the warrior was not just a lifestyle. It became your identity. Much like the sword in medieval chivalric tales, Viking weaponry held symbolic weight. But here's another popular myth that needs addressing. Not every Viking carried a sword. In fact, swords were rare and precious. They required high-quality iron, skilled forging, and significant resources. A sword might be passed down through generations, personalized with inscriptions, wrapped in memory and meaning. To be gifted a sword was often the culmination of one's training, a symbolic declaration that a man had proven worthy of such a burden. Before this honor, most youths trained with wooden or dulled versions of axes, spears, and shields. The axe was by far the most common weapon, easy to forge, versatile in battle and daily life alike. Spears were also widespread and incredibly effective in formations. The bow, meanwhile, was a critical weapon for hunting and raiding, requiring precision and patience rather than brute force. Training was relentless, especially for those in service to chieftains or kings. Morning drills in formation, evening sparring in pairs, tests of endurance, long marches, obstacle courses over rugged terrain, swimming in frigid waters. The goal was not to create muscle-bound brutes, but resilient, adaptable, battle-smart fighters. Another overlooked aspect of Viking training was psychological conditioning. Real combat is terrifying. The smell of blood, the screams, the chaos. Viking training prepared warriors not just physically, but emotionally. Elders told tales of what it felt like to be wounded, to kill, to watch a comrade die. These weren't just ghost stories. They were psychological inoculations, ways to mentally rehearse what might come. Young men were taught to manage fear, not eliminate it. Fear was natural, even useful, so long as it didn't control you. They learned to channel adrenaline into focus, to read the rhythm of battle, to anticipate rather than react. A skilled warrior could sense when a shield wall was weakening, when an opponent was overextended, or when a feint was being set up. These were not instinctual abilities. They were cultivated through storytelling, repetition, failure, and reflection. Some chieftains even incorporated ritualized duels or home gangs into training. These formal duels, fought under strict rules, served as a safe environment to test skill and courage. Victory wasn't always required, but standing your ground was. No exploration of Viking warrior culture would be complete without addressing a question that has sparked endless debate. Were there female Viking warriors? The sagas certainly speak of them. Characters like Brynhildr and Lager, the shield maidens who fought with valor and led men into battle. But are these literary flourishes or reflections of historical reality? For decades, historians leaned toward fiction. That changed in 2017, when archaeologists re-examined a famous Viking grave in Birka, Sweden. The burial site, long assumed to be a male warrior's tomb due to its weaponry and horse remains, was revealed through DNA testing to belong to a biological female. This discovery shocked the academic world. But it's important to note, this doesn't mean half the Viking warriors were women. Rather, it confirms that some women held martial roles, at least in exceptional circumstances. These might include defense of a homestead, noble leadership, or avenging familial wrongs. Whether they trained alongside male warriors is less clear, but their existence adds depth and complexity to the Viking story. Unlike modern military service, Viking warriorhood wasn't marked by a graduation day. There was no final test, no formal rank structure, no centralized training authority. Instead, training was lifelong. Every raid, every skirmish, every sparring session was both practice and proving ground. Elders continued learning even into their later years, refining techniques, shifting roles from frontline fighter to strategist, mentor, or warband leader. Knowledge was passed not through manuals, but by demonstration, correction, and lived experience. In battle, learning could be deadly, but for those who survived, the lessons were unmatched. Once the oath was sworn and the sword placed in a young warrior's hand, the next phase was no less demanding. The process of becoming battle-ready was not simply about practicing with steel. It was a full-body, full-mind transformation. Because war, to the Vikings, was not just a campaign. It was a rite of cosmic consequence, a movement that rippled across the visible world and the world unseen. When a chieftain announced a raid, the warriors of his draught, his personal warband, did not immediately run to their ships with reckless enthusiasm. There were decisions to be made, omens to read, weapons to sharpen, spirits to summon, and alliances to confirm. A Viking war campaign was as much about preparation and precision as it was about ferocity. The earliest stage of preparation began in the hall. Here, warriors met with their chieftain, not in war paint or armor, but as councilmen. The great longhouse was where strategy was born. With cups of mead in hand and maps laid out on timbered tables, the chieftain and his most trusted fighters discussed logistics. Where to strike, how many ships to take, which coastal monasteries or river towns had already been hit in previous seasons, and whether rival clans were making plans of their own. Because while Viking raids are remembered for their shock value, many were meticulously planned. The best chieftains weren't just skilled in combat, they were shrewd, calculating leaders. A poorly timed raid could cost a warband everything: ships, lives, standing. And no decision was finalized without consulting the gods. Before departure, rituals had to be observed. This wasn't optional. The Vikings believed that fate, or WYRD, was fixed, but that the favor of the gods could help you meet it with strength or shame. Sacrifices were common. A goat or horse might be offered to Odin, the All-Father and God of war and wisdom. Blood was spilled onto sacred stones, runes were cast, and seers consulted the patterns left in bone or ash. Some chieftains had their own Viking, a rune master, a kind of Norse shaman who could read signs and advise on supernatural matters. Others relied on Volvas, female seeresses who entered trance states to speak with spirits or draw upon ancestral wisdom. Their role was crucial. Was the timing favorable? Would Thor bless the stormy seas ahead? Were any warriors cursed or marked for death? Only when the signs were favorable would the warband proceed. Weapons were not merely carried, they were readied. This was a ritual in itself. Each warrior maintained his own gear. Axes were resharpened with whetstones, their heads tightly bound to fresh handles. Spear tips were reattached and shafts checked for warping. Shields were repainted, often with symbols of protection. The helm of awe, or intricate knotwork meant to invoke divine defense. A well-prepared warrior wasn't only protecting his life. He was displaying pride, readiness, and connection to the old ways. Clothing was selected carefully. Contrary to popular imagination, Vikings didn't charge into battle dressed like wild animals or bare-chested maniacs. A warrior wore layers, often linen underclothes, followed by woolen tunics, sometimes covered with leather or padded gambesons. Mail armor was rare and expensive, usually reserved for wealthy warriors or those with connections to powerful lords. Helmets were practical, often conical with nose guards, and made of iron riveted onto hardened leather. And then there was the most sacred item, the sword if he possessed one. The Viking sword was not a casual tool. It had a name. It had a story. Some blades had names like Legbiter, Bloodsnake, or Serpent's Tongue, and to carry one meant bearing the honor and weight of past generations. Warriors often spoke to their blades. They blessed them with mead. They slept beside them. To lose one in battle was not just misfortune, it was a kind of soul loss. Once the preparations were complete, and the warband had assembled, the warriors moved to their ships. The Viking longship wasn't simply transportation, it was a weapon of war in its own right. Sleek, fast, and shallow-hulled, it allowed warriors to land on beaches, slip into river systems, and strike without warning. Each ship required teamwork. Rowing wasn't just physical, it was ceremonial. Warriors rowed in rhythm, guided by drumbeat or song. Some warbands used this rhythm to enter a kind of trance, to synchronize breath and body before battle. It's worth noting that the Viking attitude toward war was very different from that of the modern soldier. These were not men conscripted by law or bound by uniform. Each man was an individual but part of something larger, his lineage, his clan. Raiding, at its core, was not always senseless plunder. It was economic strategy, vengeance, survival, or political theater. When warbands approached foreign shores, final preparations began. They landed quietly, scouts sent first to study terrain, wind, tide, and visibility. Once an attack plan was determined, the warriors gathered to share a final meal and invoke their gods one last time. For some, this would be their last meal on Midgard. Poems were recited. The sayings of the High One was often referenced, especially the verses that reminded men of the fleeting nature of life and the permanence of reputation. Cattle die, kinsmen die, all men are mortal, it says, but the name of a brave man never dies. Courage, then, was not just valued, it was immortalized. As dawn broke and sails were lowered, the warriors would rise in unison. Not all would survive. Some would fall quickly. But every man knew this. To die with your weapon in hand, face to the foe, was the only way to reach Valhalla, the warrior's paradise. But courage was only half the battle. Discipline mattered just as much. Commanders used horns or shouts to organize movement. Shield formations were adapted to terrain, tight along narrow alleys, staggered in open fields. The famous boar snout formation, a wedge-like assault tactic, was ideal for punching through enemy lines. Warbands operated not with rigid ranks, but fluid knowledge. Warriors trusted the man beside them. They knew who would flank, who would cover their blind side. Training back home had instilled instinctive movement, how to read an enemy's breath, how to shift weight mid-swing, how to feint or counter in the chaos of melee. Combat lasted minutes, sometimes hours, often decided in waves. One side would collapse first, and once retreat began, the killing intensified. Viking warriors rarely pursued without orders. Loot came later. First came control, securing the site, stabilizing losses, confirming the dead. They burned the bodies of their fallen or, when time allowed, buried them with rites. Enemy corpses might be looted, sometimes mutilated as a warning, or spared, depending on the values of the chieftain. Then, and only then, came the spoils. Viking warriors divided loot according to strict codes. The chieftain received the largest share, followed by the senior fighters, and then the younger warriors. Those who had performed valorous acts might be rewarded with extra silver or prized gear. It was an economy of honor. And yet, even in victory, a shadow followed them. Viking warriors believed deeply in curses, in ancestral vengeance, in the retribution of wronged spirits. Many would carry protective charms after a raid, small troll cores or iron amulets shaped like Thor's hammer, meant to repel evil. Some painted their shields with runes believed to protect them from nightmares, or even from the wrath of slain enemies in the afterlife. There were times when a victorious warband fell ill days later, ravaged by fever, madness, or freak accidents. These were whispered about. Some claimed they had angered local spirits or violated unspoken taboos. The fear of spiritual retribution was real, and it haunted even the most hardened of warriors. These were men who wrestled not only with blood and blade, but with guilt, fate, and the judgment of unseen forces. So when they returned home, victorious or wounded, they didn't just bring gold and stories. They brought silence, reflection, and sometimes scars that never healed, not on the body, but on the soul. Some warriors left the raiding life entirely. They became poets, farmers, storytellers. Others returned each summer, unable to resist the pull of the sea. And a few, broken by what they had done or seen, wandered far from home, nameless, silent, lost. Because not all the battles they fought were on the field. The saga of a Viking warrior was not written only on the battlefield. It was inscribed in the quiet moments before dawn, in the bonds forged between comrades, and in the code that governed every clash of steel and shield. By the time a warrior had survived his first raids, he was not simply a fighter, but a keeper of traditions older than the frozen fjords themselves. Unlike modern armies bound by laws and regulations, Viking warriors lived and died by an unwritten code, a tapestry woven from personal honor, loyalty to kin and lord, and the relentless pursuit of reputation. Honor was the currency of Viking society. It was more precious than gold, more fragile than a sword's edge. A warrior's honor was reflected in his courage, his fairness, and his willingness to defend his family's name. It was said that a man without honor was as good as dead among his people. Loyalty to one's family and lord's retinue was sacred. Breaking faith meant exile or worse, a curse that could follow a man into the afterlife. Many sagas tell of warriors who chose death over betrayal, and others who sacrificed themselves to protect the honor of their comrades. Reputation was an extension of honor. Tales of bravery, cunning, and even mercy traveled faster than arrows. A warrior's deeds were recounted in mead halls across the north, sung by skalds whose words shaped history itself. A bad reputation could lead to isolation or challenge, while a great one opened doors to alliances, wealth, and power. While popular imagery often pits Vikings against helpless monks or distant enemies, many of the deadliest battles were fought between Norse factions themselves. Civil wars, clan disputes, and power struggles were constant undercurrents. These internal conflicts tested the true mettle of warriors and the strength of their codes. In such battles, the discipline of the shield wall and strategic prowess became crucial. Warriors could not rely on brute strength alone. Victory often depended on unity and tactical intelligence. These fights were brutal and personal, with every stab and parry charged with ancestral weight. Training evolved to reflect this. Experienced warriors taught younger men how to anticipate deception, recognize enemy signals, and maintain formation under pressure. Every clash between Norse warbands was a test of loyalty and courage, because betrayal was all too common and often deadly. A Viking warrior's journey did not end with age or injury. Those who survived battles became the keepers of wisdom, mentors, and leaders of their communities. Elders taught young warriors not only how to wield weapons, but how to navigate the complex social webs of Norse society, where alliances could save or doom a clan, and where diplomacy was as vital as combat skill. They recited sagas that preserved history and ethics, reinforced codes of conduct, and prepared new generations for the burdens of war and peace alike. Every Viking warrior faced the possibility that the next fight could be his last. Battle was brutal and swift, but it was only one part of a warrior's life. Those who survived many campaigns often carried the scars, both visible and hidden. Wounds from axe and spear shaped their bodies, while the memories of comrades lost carved deep grooves in their minds. Returning home was not a return to peace, but a new challenge. Warriors had to reclaim their place in the social order, tend to their families, and sometimes rebuild what raids had destroyed. The most revered among them used their experience to guide others, sometimes as chieftains, other times as poets, counselors, or farmers. The warrior's life cycle was complete, yet the legacy was just beginning. As we close, let's revisit some of the most persistent myths surrounding Viking warriors, beyond the horned helmets we already discussed. While sagas describe berserkers entering battle in a trance-like fury, there is little evidence they were simply intoxicated warriors. Their state was likely a complex mix of psychological preparation, ritual, and cultural symbolism. Most Vikings were farmers, traders, and settlers. Raiding was seasonal and often a last resort or economic strategy, not a full-time lifestyle. On the contrary, archaeological finds reveal Vikings valued cleanliness, grooming, and even fashion. Combs, tweezers, and soap were common household items. While life expectancy was lower than today, many Vikings lived into their 50s or beyond, especially those of higher status or with stable communities. The Viking warrior has left a profound mark on history, myth, and popular culture. Yet beneath the stereotypes lies a nuanced reality. Men and women who balance brutality with strategy, faith with fear, and community with individuality. Their training was not about brute force alone, but about resilience, loyalty, and understanding the deeper meaning of honor. Their stories, both true and embellished, continue to inspire and challenge us. Today, as we sift through archaeological finds, translate ancient texts, and hear the echoes of old sagas, we come closer to knowing the Vikings not just as mythic figures, but as real people whose lives shaped the medieval world. Thank you for joining this in-depth exploration into Viking warrior training and the truths behind the myths. Your curiosity helps keep history alive, accurate, and vibrant. If you enjoyed this series, please like, share, and subscribe. Join the community to discuss, ask questions, and help uncover more forgotten stories.